Hi there. I'm standing here at the African Burial Ground in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and it stands as a memorial to the once forgotten African Americans, most of whom were slaves in our community. And it's quite likely, that a number would have sat in the gallery of North Church to hear the great evangelist George Whitefield on his visit here. This week I've been honouring Whitefield, who died 250 years ago. But I felt it would be wrong to celebrate his great achievements without being honest about his failings. George Whitefield was a slave owner. And just for the record, so was Jonathan Edwards, Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. They all participated in that great evil, the slave trade, which of course raises an important question. What do we do about the sin and injustice committed by some of our historical heroes? Well, one thing we cannot do is just ignore it or try and defend it or justify it. Any attempt to rewrite history in order to hide or explain away such issues as slavery is dishonest and misleading. The fact is, not only was Whitefield a slave owner, he actually advocated to legalize slavery in Georgia, where he wanted cheap labor to build an orphan house. Right? There really can be no defending him. What Whitefield did was morally and ethically wrong. And yet, he was a very contradictory figure. As the African American church leader, B.J. Thompson, commented, he said, let this sink in. George Whitefield was leading one of the largest spiritual revivals America has ever seen, while at the same time expanding slavery. Not only that, but it's been widely documented that when Whitefield died, it was the black community who expressed the greatest grief in America. It was a 17-year-old African slave girl in Boston named Phyllis Wheatley who wrote one of the most famous eulogies for him. And she was to become the first female African American poet to be published. But you see, how could this be? How could the slave community have loved him so much? You see, the irony of all this is that it was Whitefield who probably did the most to sow the seeds that were to ultimately undermine the whole institution of slavery. Whitefield insisted on evangelizing and educating slaves and treating them with dignity, because he understood that all men were created equal in the image of God, and that men, whether black or white, could through faith in Christ become children of God and should therefore treat each other with love and respect. He even said he was willing to face the whip of the southern planters if they disapproved of his preaching the new birth to the slaves, which they did vehemently, because they knew that if their slaves saw themselves on the same footing as their masters, of course it would subvert the whole system of slavery. But Whitefield was undeterred. He went public with his condemnation of these slave owners and published letters to them in the newspapers saying this. He said, God has a quarrel with you, right, for treating slaves as though they were brutes. He said, if these slaves were to rise up in rebellion, all good men must acknowledge their actions would be just. It would seem that Whitefield did not fully appreciate the implications of what he was saying. Blind as he was to the contradiction of both advocating slavery on one hand and undermining slavery on the other. What is clear, though, is the slave community loved him. Many thousands were converted under his preaching and found new hope, the hope of a better future in Christ. Some of the earliest spiritual songs were heard among those who Whitefield preached to. Historian Gary Nash dates the birth of black Christianity in Philadelphia to Whitefield's first preaching tour, where it's estimated he preached to around 1,000 African slaves in that city. And what they would have heard was that through Christ, they had the right to become children of God just as much as any white man. And it's why some would argue that it was Whitefield's ministry that gave birth to the African American church. And it was also Whitefield's influence that led a young William Wilberforce to spend his whole life fighting the slave trade and advocating for their emancipation. Now, that is a bitter pill for some to swallow, I know. And in no way can it excuse Whitefield's moral failure. So what then do we make of all this? Can we still admire a man like Whitefield in spite of his contradictions? I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that God uses deeply flawed people, right? The Bible is full of them, and we ourselves are no different. You know, if we'd been born in Whitfield's time, would we have acted any differently? I know we'd all like to think so, but I seriously have my doubts. I also think that Whitfield's story needs to be told, warts and all, because, you know, it's an all too familiar story of Christians who may be sincerely devoted to God and yet can be blind to, or even turn a blind eye to, certain sins, or, as in this case, institutional racism. It's a story we all need to learn from. So let me just finish with a quote from Thomas Kidd, who's a professor at Baylor University and one of Whitfield's biographers. He said this: "Instead of condemning Whitfield as irredeemable," he said, "I would suggest that we let his faults, which we can see more clearly with hindsight, let them caution us instead." He says, "Even the most sincere Christians risk being shaped more by fallen society than by the gospel." Right? Even the most sincere Christians risk being shaped more by fallen society than by the gospel. So may the Lord protect us all from that, and especially in these days in which we live.